The key figure in all processes of a biosystem is a DNA molecule, i.e. the chromosome. Paradoxically, consciousness is also governed by the genetic apparatus, because information incorporated in DNA is speech-like. Therefore, our entire future depends on how we understand the workings of the genetic apparatus. Unfortunately, the generally accepted genetic code model awarded with a Nobel Prize is incorrect. The matter is that this speech-like quality of DNA structures at the protein genetic level is inaccurate. So now errors have occurred which will lead humanity well into a catastrophe. Why? The matter is that the protein genetic code and proteins are the principal metabolic structures of DNA. The protein genetic code includes words, coding words, very short words, so-called triplets, which divided themselves into two parts. The first part was understood long ago. Those are synonyms, which are responsible for coding amino acids which compose proteins. The second part is comprised of homonyms. It is the term which I gave them. Neither Crick nor Nirenberg understood the purpose of the role of the homonyms, and it's of key significance, because it demonstrates quasi-rationality of the genetic apparatus. Because those 32 homonym codons which supplement the 32 synonym codons, those 32 homonym codons can be understood in a context only. I don't know which words are homonyms in English language, but in Russian there are many of them. For instance, the word kosa, word box in English can be used as an example, raid, ключ. Those words have multiple meanings, at least two meanings, if they come together in a process of protein biosynthesis and the genetic apparatus misinterprets them by the virtue of their double meaning and takes a wrong decision about the meaning, there will occur an error in protein synthesis, which will lead to a catastrophe. This was ignored by Nobel Prize winner Nirenberg and by Crick too. Francis Crick, who discovered the double helix together with Walter Crick, they also got a Nobel Prize for that. So they ignored the point, although in experiments they got proof of ambiguousness of the genetic coding, but they posited unambiguity. However, those homonym codons contradict that. In experiments, they discovered that the codon uridine codes simultaneously phenylalanine and leucine. In the processes of that protein synthesis, the ribosome has the task of choosing between those two meanings of that codon, either phenylalanine or leucine. Two amino acids, it's very significant. The choice determines the precision of protein synthesis. If the choice is wrong, it will lead to a catastrophe. They ignored that point, and it was said in particular by one of those who understood that coding follows the principle 2 out of 3, because the third varies. It would be a long story, and there was Ulf Lagerquist, who said that the homonym codon can be found very rarely. It's wrong, just wrong, and it's a gross error. There are a lot of homonym codons. One homonym codon, uridine, is enough to spoil and distort the entire genetic code. But this doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen because the genetic apparatus, the protein which synthesizes the apparatus, is a quasi-rational structure. When it makes decisions, reads the entire information of DNA, like a whole text, i.e., like a context. All homonyms, both in human language and in genetic language, all homonym codons can be understood in a context, i.e., looking on the whole in the whole phrase, just like in human speech. When we come across a word with multiple meanings, we understand it in a context. The same thing occurs in the genetic apparatus. When protein synthesis takes place, that point was grossly violated, ignored, and what did that lead to? What we are now experiencing. For nearly 50 years they have not paid attention, but now they will have to do that, because huge efforts are made to produce genetically modified foods. What are genetically modified foods? They are the results of wrong protein synthesis, because genes, transgenes, are used which are introduced into biosystem. For instance, in tomatoes, wheat, barley, anywhere. This leads to chaotization of context landscapes of genes. Hence, wrong protein synthesis. When wrong amino acids are included into proteins, we get anomalous proteins. While the body almost doesn't react, but since their quantity is enormous, sooner or later there arises a situation when a body confronts a protein, a wrong protein, which causes, for instance, cancer. Those processes are clearly proven in this country, and not only in this country. It's proven that those proteins are cancerogenic. This is a catastrophe for the biosystem. Nevertheless, those so-called transgenic foodstuffs are produced on a massive scale, and that will lead us to genetic collapse. This is one thing, and in particular in the US, as I told you, all honeybees have died out. Why? Because they were collecting pollen from transgenic plants, transgenic flowers. So the blow, the toll of the bell has happened already. Now, another very important thing, which also demonstrates that we are on a way to catastrophe. The Gulf of Mexico, the 2010 oil spill. The problem arose how to clean that oil spill. A molecular biologist came up quite well known, a colleague of mine, Craig Venter, and the British Petroleum team hired him, pays him a very high salary.
Оплачивать очень высоко. И была поставлена задача создать
The task was to create microorganism that will wipe out oil. He managed to do that, but since he didn't understand and doesn't understand the linguistic aspect of genetic coding, gross errors were committed. Those bacteria that he called synthias are from the word synthetics. They have a synthetic genetic apparatus with artificially implanted genes, transgenes, which are responsible for wiping out oil. Those synthia successfully managed wiping out oil, but they started to destroy, and it was totally unexpected, started to kill all living things in the Gulf of Mexico. Fish, seaweed, corals, seals, whales, and finally people started to die on the seashore. It's played down by every means, but those facts are obvious. They are glaring, and sooner or later it will come up. And what should be done about that? I don't know what should be done. Or maybe they do that for purpose, because there is the golden billion concept. There are 7 billion people now on Earth, but the ruling top, the elite, DuPonts, Rockefellers, etc., they put forward the golden billion concept to annihilate 6 billion out of 7. Therefore, they are being annihilated by every method, such as vaccination, chemtrails, which are dispersed over the US, over Europe, and also over Russia. This will lead to women stopping bearing children and the shrinkage of the population. It's a second effect of an erroneous understanding of genetic coding, but it's not all, because the functions of genetic coding are much wider and protein synthesis is just one aspect of coding, a very important one, but just one. There are other aspects of genetic coding which are related to holographic memory, holographic functions of the genetic apparatus, and there are many proofs of that. In particular, our studies, for instance, you take a leaf of a living plant, cut off part of it, put that living little leaf in certain electromagnetic field, a sparkling image of the leaf appears, but the whole one, regardless of fact that one part of it was cut off. It's an example of holographic memory, and what's important, especially for you, the cerebral cortex operates like a hologram. The entire brain, and especially the cerebral cortex, which is superfluous, informationally superfluous, is holographic. Therefore, in many cases, when someone had their brain injured and part of the brain was destroyed, that fact didn't have any impact on the mind. Moreover, paradoxically, there were people, and there were such cases as well, that have no brain at all. Nevertheless, their thinking was normal. Why? Because the entire biosystem works like a hologram, and the remainder of the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, including the spinal cord, works like a hologram and performs the functions of the brain, including endocrinal functions and etc. This is the second aspect. The first is linguistic, the second is holographic, and finally the third facet, the third key function of the genetic apparatus, which is also ignored by official science, is quantum non-locality. Quantum non-locality or teleportation of genetic information. It means cells communicate with one another via electromagnetic fields, not simply electromagnetic fields, however, but torsional fields. Why torsional exactly? Because our genetic apparatus, our chromosomes, are emitters of torsional, photonic fields. Photonic fields. Any electromagnetic field includes a photonic field, and they always have a torsional component. The torsional component arises from optical activity of chromosomes. All our DNA molecules, of which chromosomes are composed, all RNAs, all proteins, all metabolites, including the main macromolecules, DNA, RNA, proteins, all of them are optically active, i.e. rotate plane polarized light. It means they acquire torsional component. Any optical rotation implies creation of torsional fields. All genetic, most of the genetic information is recorded in torsion fields. In what ways is it good for a biosystem? In what way is quantum non-locality good? It ensures instantaneous connection of cells with one another. It means there is no act of transmission per se because the transmission time equals zero, i.e. it's instantaneous transmission. A biosystem, all those billions, about 200 billions of our cells, they know about the condition of one another instantaneously. The entire biosystem, all the cells are in entangled states. It's a huge advantage of molecular systems that emerged in the course of evolution, which allows operating genetic information at quantum level.
Опять-таки я возвращаюсь к биосинтезу белков. Значит, наше мышление
And again, going back to protein biosynthesis, our thinking and consciousness are realized via the workings of chromosomes, brain neurons. The most powerful protein biosynthesis is displayed by brain chromosomes. The biochemical equivalent of consciousness and thinking is the proteins, which are a certain similitude of phrases and sentences. And that quick protein synthesis and breakdown is a sort of equivalent, biochemical equivalent of consciousness and thinking. Because any thinking is performed via speech, well, this is the ultimate level, which is preceded by the subconscious level. When intuition works, and it absolutely doesn't depend on speech. We did experiments, I've told you about them, in which we talked to plants, just like your great scientist Luther Burbank had done. We talked to them in Russian, English and German. different, and we addressed abracadabra to control samples, and we evoked reparation of chromosome in plants, wheat and barley, which were administered a radiation of 2000 hours. The control samples died, and we managed to cause the restoration of the genetic apparatus in the test samples. For that reason, human speech is quasi-genetic structure, and vice versa. Speech is also a speech structure. It means DNA is quasi-speech and speech is quasi-DNA. This thesis is significant. It's one of the key premises of linguistic wave genetics that we are promoting now.
Теперь практическое приложение вот этих теоретических положений, о которых я сказал, я их очень коротко перечислил.
Now, practical application of the theoretical thesis I've spoken about. I've enumerated them briefly because it's a very big presentation. Practical application. We need to create hardware which stimulates quantum processes in chromosomes and to use them in particular application. That hardware was found by us and it's based on lasers, because chromosomes themselves are lasers emitting radiation in the range of 250-800 nanometers, the visible range, and we found that laser. It's different from ordinary lasers in a way that it can operate. It can feel polarization of test subjects, including polarization of DNA molecules, RNA, proteins, generally of all metabolites of a biosystem. And all metabolites of a biosystem, particularly without exception, are optically active. As it turned out, that laser can read those metabolic states, the number of which is infinite, transform them into torsional form and transmit in a quantum non-local way both inside the biosystem and outside of it. Therefore, when a person meditates, thinks, etc., all this emanates from him and works across the entire globe, across the universe. That laser works as a system of information scanning and information transmission, long distance and short distance transmission, any distance, torsional information. It sort of simulates elementary acts of consciousness and thinking in our chromosomes. This can be used, and we have used it. For instance, we can give living cells, for example blood cells, and read information from them and transmit it anywhere. We can take a DNA molecule and RNA molecule and so forth, and we can read information from them and transmit long distance in the form of a torsion field. There is a theory which explains why the red photons of our laser are transformed into broadband electromagnetic field. It's a theory of localized photons, but it's a long story. It's physics, mathematics.
Вот теперь практические приложения. Что мы сделали? Я вам рассказывал, практические приложения создают прецеденты, которых медицина не знает.
Now, practical applications. What we did. I've told you about it. Practical applications create precedents that medicine doesn't know and is just dreaming about. And we are doing that. First of all, what we do is we program stem cells. If we program stem cells using those torsion fields, we govern the entire metabolism of a biosystem. We can delay aging, prolong human life to 1,000 or more years, create quantum biocomputers, which are more powerful than all computers that the world knows, put together, create long-distance space communications, create bio-internet, annihilate pests, annihilate all pathogenic bacteria and viruses, notably the Ebola virus. It's not a problem killing the HIV, the Ebola virus, the flu virus, no difficulty. We had model tests in which we transmitted the information, distorted torsional information, to a very distant location, 7 kilometers far. The information was taken from a ruined genetic apparatus, and we killed plants 7 kilometers away. One of our employees was nearly killed, a person with whom I worked for 8 years. Not yet fully understanding those processes, we took ruined chromosomes of that individual, and he nearly died.
Испорченные хромосомы этого сотрудника, и этот сотрудник чуть не погиб.
Those were negative results, but then we realized that we can no longer work in that direction because it's working in the direction of nuclear weapons, in the direction of superior genetic weapons. So we abandoned those attempts to get something here after we realized it's a very dangerous process, and we switched to positive. And one of the positive results that we first obtained in Moscow in 2000 and then in Toronto in 2001 and 2002, we got there is a transmission of information from normal pancreatic glands of a newborn rat to adult rats with a destroyed pancreatic gland. We did an experiment in which we destroyed the pancreatic gland. It's the so-called alloxan model of diabetes, and nearly all rats died in the control group. And in the test group, when we input that information into rats who were on the verge of dying, they had no pancreatic gland, they had type 1 diabetes, they were dying, and in that moment we read information from the pancreatic glands of newborn infant rats. We transmitted that information to a location 20 kilometers away in Toronto, and all of our rats survived. After that, those results, when we came back from Toronto to Moscow, we did those experiments in Russia in Nizhny Novgorod with even more success, and we've seen that on even more rats. Moreover, we discovered so-called wave immunity which no one else had seen before, and we have also discovered memory, that any biosystem that is destroyed and poisoned by some way lives after it. A phantom, which is biologically active, and one had better abstain from entering the image where that phantom used to be. There were other cases which also set a precedent in the usage of those technologies connected with the application of that laser. For instance, we performed regeneration of the eye retina of a blind woman. The eyesight was restored completely. Medicine didn't know that and had no suspicion of possibility of that, but it turned out to be possible. We cure children suffering from cystic fibrosis when part of DNA is missing. It's a mutation, and children with that condition die. Mucovasculosis or cystic fibrosis is a deadly disease. Practically no children manage to survive. Here we used a very interesting technology, scanning information from photos of healthy children. Well, for instance, if there is a sick child, we take a photo of either his dad or his mom. In case of a cystic fibrosis, we took information from a cousin of the sick child. We transmitted the information to the sick child in the form of an acoustic field. Because we recorded torsional information which is irradiated from the lasers in the form of a broadband electromagnetic field, we pick up that radiation like a radio station with a radio receiver working on a certain frequency, and we recorded it in the form of a sound in ordinary formats, MP3, wave, etc. And that acoustic information still works even when it's recorded in the form of a sound. So the sound contains a torsion component. That work is, it's unknown. In that way, we managed to cure children from cystic fibrosis with a mutation preserved. It's a perfectly paradoxical situation for medicine when a mutation is preserved but the child is healthy. Naturally, official medicine or genetics have no explanation for that. It can be explained only from the standpoint of our studies, part of which was discovery of DNA phantoms. It turns out my work started with my discovery of DNA phantoms in 1984 using the correlation laser spectroscopy method, dynamic laser diffusion, and I recorded those phantoms in the form of a recording. For a long time we could not understand how they should be used. We just stated as a fact that genetic information could exist in the form first of that broadband magnetic field, which I've talked about, i.e. the torsion field, the torsion component of that field, and second in the form of phantoms. DNA phantoms are probably one of the ways that genetic information exists and functions in DNA molecules. Those phantoms work. In particular, when there is that mutation caused by cystic fibrosis and they create a quantum plug which, so to speak, stops the hole in the DNA molecule. I simplify, of course. Then we had unique cases, precedents when we regenerate the small intestine of sick people, we cause the regeneration of teeth, regeneration of hair, but all those are solitary cases because to do that on a wide scale, one has to have a clinic of one's own. We don't have that, and all that is suppressed in Russia. There were other cases, totally unique. I'm not going to give them now because there are lots of them, but all of them are unprecedented. So what are the prospects? The prospects of that new scientific area originating from Gurevich in the 20s of the past century, it's our scientist Gurevich expressed an idea which is the key idea for wave genetics. Now it's not wave, it's linguistic wave. And he said a chromosome had a field equivalent. It's precisely with the field equivalent of DNA that we are working. Everyone who knows and understands languages of wave equivalence, and we have particularly understood that, can manage a biosystem any way they like. So it's a breakthrough for humankind into a totally different path of development and to completely different levels of genetic coding, when a biosystem can be dictated, in the better sense of this word, any attributes. Gene structures can be imparted which will be managing the body in a completely unexpected way, including not only those structures which are protein genes, but there are also quantum genes which are derived from holograms, and in a hologram almost anything can be recorded. So the genetic apparatus, I repeat, is a multiplex polarization hologram, i.e. a spin hologram, and you can record anything in a hologram, any information, and using that information it's possible to design quantum biocomputers that possess capacity which is just incomparable with that of today's digital computers. It's possible to design biointernet. It's clear that the genetic information we transmit is speech-like, quasi-speech, i.e. mental. We de facto teleport genetic information. From thence, it's just one step to creation of hardware which will be using our capacity for telepathy. Implicitly exists, and it must be reinforced significantly, transmitting brainwaves to our devices, transforming them into torsional fields. In that way, telepathy arises and any and all can use it. That can be used as basis for biointernet. Long-distance space communications. It's a challenge for space traveler. It will be performed instantaneously and without any hindrances. Then, creation of any hybrids of plants and animals, prolongation of life for any distance, prolongation of life for any number of years, and people will be able to die at will. Our biblical patriarchs, Methuselah, Noah, and his sons lived 800 or 900 years, and no one was surprised, and now we live 70 or 80 years. It's next to nothing. The program was reduced by nobody knows whom and what for. This can be opposed. Then those horrible diseases that I told you about, the Ebola virus, the flu virus, the HIV, etc., they can be eradicated very easily and in an environmentally friendly way. Therefore, the prospects that lie ahead for linguistic wave genetics are totally immense. But implementation of those principles and their applications for the benefit of the people confronts huge opposition of the very higher-ups, which are the invisible levers that govern the entire globe. Those are command posts occupied by billionaires, the DuPonts, the Rockefellers, and so on and so forth. Therefore, something should be done, and implementation should be carried out. How? It's unclear. We need government support. So far, we have none either in Russia or in the US. The only thing they are trying to make weapons out of it. Our latest achievement that I wanted to dwell upon specifically is we transform wave components of the DNA into a material form. We materialize the wave form of the DNA, and we do that with the help of a PCR system. PCR is a polymerase chain reaction of DNA biosynthesis, i.e. DNA can be used, its components can be used using polymerase, a DNA enzyme, for synthesis of the real matrix of the DNA. It's an absolute condition, a must for molecular biology and genetics, and we bypassed it just like that, the same way Luc Montagnier, a Nobel Prize winner, did. We concomitantly provided the same thing, albeit by different ways. We proved that in 2000, when we transmitted genes to a distance and we caused regeneration of the pancreatic gland, and Luc Montagnier transmitted a piece of the DNA to clear water, and there he created a PCR reaction, i.e. synthesized a real DNA out of its phantom. We did the same thing, but our laser-based technology uses longer DNA fragments and we materialized DNA. It means we got the DNA substance out of a phantom. If we do that, we do virtually the most important thing. It's the basic point of linguistic wave genetics, operating the wave equivalent of genes, materializing them and using them to the benefit of people. So, this is what I wanted to say briefly.
Okay.